Great, thank you, and thank you for that kind invitation, introduction and also invitation to be here. I've got to tell you, I'm feeling a little bit out of place being here at the Faculty of Pharmacy, and then also because a lot of my talk is focused on testing, and testing that goes beyond assessment. But after I heard one of the keynotes today on cognitive load theory and being in some sessions that are looking at tools that help assess students in real time, I think this should fit in well, but hopefully I'll do my best to be able to connect that for you. So really what we're going to be talking about today is this phenomenon known as the testing effect. And this is really looking at, to me, the absolutely remarkable impact of retrieval practice, right? So not just how we get information into our students' brains or in our own brains, but what does it mean for when we go into there and try to retrieve that information and how that enhances learning. And for me, because I'm at the Faculty of Pharmacy, but I think that makes a lot of sense in engineering too, how does it promote long-term memory retention? So I'm not just interested in the short-term performance. I'm thinking over the long term. My pharmacy students are eventually going to practice mostly in Ontario. I'm going to get older. They're going to be caring for me. They're caring for you. I want them to remember what I've taught them and to be able to build on that to continue to be competent, which is how I got a lot more interested in this space. So I'm a pharmacist. Became very interested in education afterwards, did my PhD more in the education sphere, and now teach mostly in pharmacy practice, but most of my research is in the education space, to give you a sense of who I am. So the testing effect. This is a classroom in Australia, a picture from 1947. And to be honest, this is what I think of when I think about testing, right? All the multiple times that I was tested over and over again in my education, almost all of it was about assessment. Did I know what I was supposed to know, right? But we know that the testing effect tells us that the actual retrieval of information, every time I was tested and I was retrieving that information, it strengthened my memory recall. And that's because a lot of research is showing that when we think about our memories and our information as static, but actually every time we go into, I know I'm saying go in because that seems so clumsy, but that's sort of what it's like. It actually, you're not just accessing something static, you're actually changing the structure in the memory. So we think that that's a little bit of what's happening. So it is a very active process, and it stimulates the brain to reconstruct and reinforce these neural pathways, which lead to more durable learning outcomes. So research consistently shows that incorporating regular testing into study routines promotes more efficient learning. The other thing that it does is engaging in self-testing actually tends to, not in all cases, but in many cases, enhance metacognitive skills, right? It allows learners to monitor and assess their own understanding and identify knowledge gaps. Again, really important when we think about professionals who are only with us for a few years and then start practicing and have to think about how they're going to keep their knowledge up to date. What do they know? What can they rely on? But what do they actually, maybe when is there a gap and how are they going to fill that? And I have a couple studies that will sort of highlight how the testing effect can help with metacognitive skills as well. So probably most of you know this, but I just want to say when we think of testing, it's not just about assessment, but it's a powerful way to improve learning. And in many situations, certainly in the university lecture courses that I teach, tests are given pretty infrequently, maybe a couple times a year. I have a final exam, and it's generally perceived as like a massive bother, definitely by my students, but actually also for me. And the reason I'm saying this is that the testing that I'm talking about now that's usually researched in some of the experiments that I'll show you, they're actually looking at very low stakes assessments. So these aren't talking about big final exams. Although I definitely have a moment, I remember when I was in pharmacy school where I was writing an exam and then it all clicked like on the actual exam, which was like, oh my goodness, this is the wrong time for this to be happening. But we're really talking about low stakes retrieval practice that accompanies study afterwards. And you'll see that in the design of some of this. So as I was mentioning earlier, I'm also very interested in long-term retention, and we know that that simple act of retrieval has a powerful effect on long-term retention. Okay, so the first experiment that I kind of want to share with you is this very seminal paper on test-enhanced learning. This is Roediger and Karpicki, and this study was actually done in 2006. So here I am, like talking about quite old research compared to what many of the talks are talking about here, but I think sometimes it's overlooked, which is why I'm sharing it with you now. So this study shed light on this phenomenon known as the testing effect. And it showed that self-testing or engaging in this retrieval process enhanced learning and long-term memory retention compared to passive review or reading. And so they showed that the way that they describe it is it strengthens memory traces and promotes better retrieval of that information in the future. So the thing about cognitive psychology experiments is they usually do like 6 experiments in a row, and they all describe all these like tiny little variations all the way through to try to get through the mechanism. I'm only going to show you maybe 2 of their experiments here, but I think they're the ones that hopefully will be most instructive for you if this is new. So this was 120 undergrad students from Washington University between the ages of 18 and 24, and they took part in this study as part of a course requirement. And basically, the Roediger and Karpicki chose 2 250-word prose passages. It was from like English as a second language, some sort of testing information that they had, and they used that. And they had 2 independent variables. So learning condition, I don't have a marker, but basically they had students who studied and then restudied, and then they actually used the participants experienced the same, like a different condition to balance it out, so they would have study and then test. And then they were interested in how the students would perform in 5 minutes, doing a test, 2 days, and then 1 week. And really this allowed them to examine the effects of both learning condition and delay on memory recall. Hopefully this is making sense. I think when you see the results, it will. So if we look here on the graph, and I know it's hard for some of you to see this, but this is where, to me, like, I find this very interesting. So after 5 minutes, so basically this is students cramming, right? It doesn't matter whether they're studying or studying. Actually, they tend to do a little bit better if they study the material and then study it again. 5 minutes later, they're actually doing a little bit better than those who study the material and test. And this makes sense, right? This is cramming. This is what all my students do before their exams when I'm hanging outside. They're like looking at their notes, they go in, and then they just write it right away. And it does work for the short term. But then, of course, we see this flip, right, at 2 days and then at 1 week, where we can see that those who study the material first and then are tested on it, and of course, these are controlled for time and everything, we can see a huge difference 2 days later, and then a week later, the difference is actually there. And why I wanted to show you this experiment is because in the testing experiment, the students weren't told whether they got the right answer or not, right? And they weren't given any other information. So they've actually only experienced that information once during that first study period. And this was pretty seminal at the time. So their conclusion was really on these tests of long-term retention, students who'd taken initial test recalled more than subjects who had only studied the passage. So then for experiment, I think it was experiment 2 here, Roediger and Karpicki said, okay, if testing's great, what about if there's like a whole bunch more testing, right? Like, is this testing effect something that if a student is tested more times, would the size of this testing effect increase? So they did the same type of experiment, but I've tried to lay it out here. It's hard to describe these sometimes. So if you were in group 1, right, you were assigned to that condition, you would study some text, you'd do a distractor task, then you would study, study, study. So it's like 4 studying opportunities to read the same 250-word text. Group 2 studied, 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 and then had 1 test. And then group 3 studied, and they did the test 3 times. Again, no answers about like whether it was right, and this was free recall, so just basically asking them what they actually remembered. And they also asked participants to predict how well they would remember the passage. So I won't ask for raised hands or anything, but if I were to give you a passage of 250 words, and I said you have the opportunity to study this 4 times, and then you're going to write a test, and if you do well, you win a trip to Italy. Or you can study it once, and then you can just freely recall 3 times. I suspect most of you would choose the first condition. And so when they asked students participants in all 3 groups to predict, like how well are you going to remember the information? And this is, as one of my PhD supervisors would say, a very tough condition, because if anything, the group 1 is super biased. Like, you would think that they would do much better in this experiment because there's no feedback. The person's only experienced it once. Okay, you get it. So these are the results. You can see if at the test that was at 5 minutes, we can see that SSSS is study, 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 study. There's actually no major difference, but really, it looks like they're outperforming those who study 3 times and then are tested compared to those who study and then test 3 times. But we can see at a week the same result happens, which is, I think, pretty surprising. And this is where some of the data, this is the data that supports the testing effect, really. And so clearly the testing effect is not simply a result of students gaining re-exposure to this material during testing, because restudying allows students to experience 100% of the material each time. And even that seems to produce pretty poor long-term retention if you look at this. So I would say in this case, the positive effects of the testing were quite dramatic. What's also interesting is that the repeated studying groups, the participants in those groups actually had a pretty inflated confidence about how what they knew and what they would remember. And I find this not surprising now that I've been teaching a number of years. Many students who are struggling in my courses, they come see me during office hours. I'm asking them how they're studying, and they're saying, oh, I'm rereading and rereading, I'm highlighting. And that can actually feel really good in the moment, but actually doesn't tend to lead to very good long-term outcomes. And it's actually a strategy, if you look at some of the, even not necessarily our university, but other university websites, this idea of like highlighting and rereading is something that's often suggested to students. Okay, so in short, and this is really where a lot of my research surrounds this idea, performance does not equal to learning. So performance on a test at 5 minutes after you've studied something does not necessarily lead to this durable long-term learning, which we know our students need, even if it doesn't feel good. And so I'm going to talk at the end about how I incorporate some of these strategies into my classes. But I want you to think, especially for those of you who I think all of us here teach in some context or another, things like ways to harness this testing effect. And there's lots of ways with technology that we can do this, but it still comes back to the information that brains are receiving and then outputting, and thinking about ways that we can harness this. So I've certainly seen, and when I was a student, profs who would incorporate frequent quizzes into a class's structure. We know that that will promote student learning. Another really fantastic way is it takes a lot of self-control on behalf of the person who is teaching. If you can leave your last 5-10 minutes of class, and instead of you summarizing what you've taught, ask students to produce that, to generate it, to go back and recall what's happened and say, okay, see if you can write 5 bullet points about what we've talked about in class. What do you think the most important parts? And that is so much more powerful than you summarizing that for them. It's hard. It's hard to get students to do that, and there's very interesting data about whether if students know that this is better, whether they'll do it or not. And the answer is probably knowing about it doesn't make a big difference, but encouraging that is something that's going to be far better for their long-term learning. All right, so now I'm going to talk about something even weirder. It's called pretesting. And so this is comes out of the same body of knowledge about testing and like the testing effect generally. So Nate Cornell in 2009 started asking, okay, so if testing afterwards is good, what if we test before somebody knows anything? Which may sound very bizarre to you, but I'll show you the results of that and then show you how I've been using that in my classroom. But basically, the idea is, what if you don't know very much about a topic at all, and I'm going to give you a test prior to that, and I'm going to see whether that helps your further long-term learning. So I see lots of puzzled looks on your faces, and I get that. It's a bit weird. But it's really this idea of retrieval. Retrieving something, even if there's not a lot of knowledge in your mind, can actually give you better internal feedback and works even when you get few or no correct answers, believe it or not. So testing, even before you've had access to the material as a learning experience, also helps learning. You are probably going to perform at chance, my students do, but it improves, or the word that I like to use is it potentiates learning. So even though you've bombed it, you do better on tests about that knowledge if you've done a pretest first. So I think about this as testing as a learning experience, and it also helps future learning. So Jerry Little and Elizabeth Bjork, some of you might recognize Bjork's name from Desirable Difficulties. Her and her husband out at UCLA, who's Bob Bjork, did like the seminal research in the 90s and late 80s on desirable difficulties, right? So that's like mass versus space studying, generation, those types of things. And one of her grad students who now teaches there, Jerry Little, did a lot of research on multiple choice pretesting that potentiates learning of related information. I don't have tons of time to talk about the nuances between pretesting. You can think of pretesting students with multiple choice questions, right? So that would be me asking you, okay, you have a 59-year-old male who's suffering from neuropathic pain from a history of type 2 diabetes. Which medication do you think would be a good first-line option for him? And I may say amitriptyline, nortriptyline, duloxetine, and carbamazepine. So that would be giving you options, and you could choose. I could also give you a short answer kind of question, like what would you choose? Or I could just say free recall. What do you know about neuropathic pain in people in their 50s who've had type 2 diabetes? And there's lots of research that looks at the benefit of either. Jerry Little and Bjork use multiple choice, and I'll sort of explain a little bit more about that. Right, so I'm just going to show you the experiment 3 because I think it's a little bit more useful to sort of back up this point, and then we'll have some time to talk about it before I finish up. So they wanted to know, they'd sort of already showed that pretesting works, but they hadn't shown like, does it work longer than 2 hours, basically? Does that effect last that long? And they also wanted to know whether multiple choice pretesting fosters retention of non-tested related information. And I'll get a little bit more into that, but this is, I think, where a lot of the research is going in this field. So participants were first given pretests for 2 different passages, and importantly, the pretest didn't provide feedback. You're probably sensing a theme. So the results here, they were statistically significant. They don't look as stunning as the previous research from Roediger and Karpicki. But what was clear is that after 48 hours, the benefit of multiple choice questioning, also of cued recall, persists even when feedback isn't provided. You can see that compared to the reading-only group. And so just to translate this briefly, really what it means is that if I were then to follow up with a lecture on neuropathic pain and type 2 diabetes in people in their 50s, you would now do better than if you had done a reading first and then listened to my lecture. That's kind of like the short end of it. And again, there's something about that recall experience, even when you don't have the specific information, that seems to provide benefit. And so I guess a shortened conclusion is that trying to answer multiple choice questions can provide unique benefits to the learning of subsequently studied related and competitive information. And it seems to outweigh that of other activities, most importantly pre-study. So again, a practical piece of this is if you're asking students to prepare for your class, you often, like I certainly do, I provide pre-readings. My students don't read them. They don't access them. I can see that on Quarkus. I know, it's amazing what you can see on Quarkus. Actually, it's disturbing. But actually, what would be better for me to do is to actually ask them to answer some multiple choice questions before. And as long as they're engaging in it, even if they don't know the answer, that's probably going to be more beneficial. And it'll be beneficial for the related, but also the competitive information. So you're probably wondering why. I don't totally know. Nobody knows exactly why this works. Something about answering these multiple choice questions leads to deeper processing of the information than what results from simple exposure. Another part of my research that I'm interested in is how to incorporate struggle in learning, and it's very much related to desirable difficulties. But sometimes when we're learning and it feels really good, like reading and rereading, it may not actually be the same type of study for our students that leads to this long-term learning. Certainly simple exposure. It's really easy to listen to something or read something and say, oh yeah, that makes sense, I totally get it. But you don't get it, and so then it just sort of fades away or isn't accessible. I also think it really directs attention more broadly during subsequent reading, right? Some of you may know what nortriptyline was, but others of you may not have heard of duloxetine, and now you're thinking, oh yeah, if I came across a reading, I'd be kind of curious about that. That's also an antidepressant. How does this work? So it's helping connect things for you instead of, they think with short answer recall questions, you get really narrow, and so multiple choice questions, if they have really good competitive alternatives, can sort of direct your things more broadly. How am I doing on time? Awesome. Okay, timing's right. So how have I utilized this in my courses? Well, I was fortunate to get a D3 QA grant through the Vice Provost Office, and what I decided to do is use it in one of my simulation courses. So I teach the third year PharmD students in the fall a simulation course. We have them come in for 3 hours every week, and they interact with standardized patients. So these are actors who are acting as patients, and it's their last course to sort of see whether they're ready to go out and start on their placements. And one of the things that I teach is something called renewing prescriptions. So pharmacists in Ontario are now able to renew prescriptions if you've run out. So if you need a birth control prescription and you can't get to your family doctor or nurse practitioner under certain circumstances, a pharmacist could renew that for you, write a prescription that would get you until you can see your family doctor again. Some of my students work in community pharmacies where their pharmacists are doing this, and so they're really familiar with it, and they do great. There are some students who work in community pharmacies where the pharmacists don't do this. They don't think that this is, for whatever reason, they don't practice this way, which is a whole other issue, and they struggle. And then I have some students who have never worked in a community pharmacy, even by third year, and they're the ones who tend to do quite poorly historically in this lab. And so using some money from this grant and some of the research that I've showed you, what I decided to do is, for the Renewing Prescription Simulation Lab, I designed pre-questions that students needed to complete before they came to my lecture. It was actually a colleague's lecture. They went to the lecture, we had post-questions, and then we had the simulation. So for the students who had no experience of renewing prescriptions, this was a pre-quiz or pre-testing on information that they had no idea about. For my students who had exposure to it, that's great. They're probably going to do fine anyway, and this is a way for them to test their information. So this is kind of what happens when you're taking these experiments that are done under very controlled settings and try to translate them into the classroom. That's fine. You just have to know the theory behind it and what you're doing, and probably what's happening for students, even if they're taking the same quiz, is different, and that's fine. The students, if they didn't complete this prior to the lecture, they didn't pass they didn't pass. So we had a very high rate of completion. You laugh, but I think it was really important to me, and I thought, okay, we're going to do this. So you can see here the pre-quiz, there's like a little stem, and they can choose what they want. And I actually didn't give them the right answer or not. I wanted them to come to lecture and think, okay, like, oh, I'm not actually sure when I'm able to do this or not. I better pay attention. We had a post-quiz, and in this case, I did give them the right or the wrong answer, and I gave them the reason why. So the why is really important. So I explained why what they did was maybe, why they chose something was maybe not so correct, and what the right thing is to do. And then we had the simulation, right? And so in short, and this, again, I don't know if Chin's in the room anymore. There were a few statisticians who helped me a lot with this, because even though I'm a pharmacist and everyone's like, oh yeah, math, chemistry, like stats is not a big strong point of mine. And so they created these violin plots for me. But like the overall gist of it is that we had a lot of students who did, you can see the range on that pre-quiz, that's the most left-hand side. Some people who got like almost nothing, and some people who got 100%. The post-quiz, what was great is that almost all the scores were like high. It was like 88, no matter what your score was on the pretest. And then the simulation, that's like averaged out to about 70, even though it's honors pass fail. There's another way to look at it. What I'm most interested in is those students who are getting less than 2 on that pre-quiz. And what we can see is it's actually a pretty similar pass rate, regardless of whether you had a lot of knowledge coming in or not at all. And funnily enough, the only students who got honors were ones who had done quite poorly on the pre-quiz, which I think is probably just chance, but we'll see again this year when we run it. I also teach in a pharmacotherapy in older adults course, and so I used pre-testing prior to all of the lectures, and I used participation points here. So I had like 6 to 10 questions that had to be completed prior to the lecture. If you completed all of them, then you got 2 participation marks. I'm working with a student now because I think I haven't quite got the incentive structure right, but the point is that I'm just encouraging them to do these questions before they come to lecture. Okay. So I think I'm getting close to 5 minutes left, so I'd like to leave the floor open for questions. But basically, some strategies you can think about is either designing tests in Quarkus or whatever technology you're looking at. There's tons of different things that have been presented today that you could incorporate this. And I wanted you to think not just about like how you're presenting information for students to learn, but how you're also asking them to retrieve in the environments that I guess like that you're teaching them in. Also, taking time during lecture, I think, is also this is a very reasonable, I think, use of time when we're thinking about the value that it adds for our students. So I think I'm going to stop there. I really appreciate your attention. It's late in the afternoon, and it's been a long, like, very interesting day, but I appreciate it, and I'm happy to answer any questions now or later. So thank you. Lots of questions. Okay, yeah, we'll just go like this, yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Great presentation, thank you so much. I had a question about the testing, like for the research studies. I noticed like the increments of time was like 5 minutes or 1 week. I wonder why those were set as increments, and if there are any like long-term look at that, like 1 year or like 6 months.
I've yet to see one that's 6 months to 1 year. Part of it is, it's a great question, and I don't have a very good answer. Usually 1 week, in the studies that I run, 1 week works out really well, because if a student's available on Monday morning to do the first part of my experiment, they're usually available. I know you're laughing, but these are huge like practical considerations, and finding students like 6 months later to participate is like much more difficult, but it's a good critique, and I think it's one that's a critique of many of these studies. So. Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
In your pre-tests, were you asking questions that you expected them to know from previous knowledge, or you would actually be more appropriate asking them after your class? You just happened to ask them before. Like, what are the chances that they would actually know the answers?
So there's a lot of variability by the time they get to third year, and so sometimes I don't fully know. Some of my students in my older adults course have grandparents that they're maybe starting to get involved in their care, and they actually can know more. So the range becomes a lot wider. The truth is, I don't care. Like, I ask hard questions that I want them to know the answer to. Most of my students don't. So if I look at the results, it's mostly chance. But if they do, great, then they know that, and they maybe then from the metacognitive side say, you know what, maybe I don't need to focus on this so much, but boy, I better focus on that. So I think that because I asked them to do it before class, it should direct their attention either way, as long as they're actively participating. And that's a big weakness, because I can definitely see there's a few times that students 5 minutes before class would just click through it. Not a lot I can do yet, I guess. Yeah, did you have a question?
I have like 2 questions. One is, have you looked at the motivation that this brings for pre-testing? Because like I'm in engineering,
Yeah.
students are super competitive.
Yeah.
So I can see them being like, oh, I got the pre-test wrong. I'm gonna like, really try to get that answer, and it helps like motivate them. In the end, they're learning the material, which is really great.
Yeah.
So if you had a chance to like look at motivation of students and if that's affecting their performance.
I really want to. It's hard to find a good measure for that. Michael Inslicht here in sociology, I took some course, or like in social psych, sorry, I took a course or two with him when I did my PhD here, and he has like really good. The problem is when you're introduced to someone's amazing research on motivation, then I only want to, like, it's hard to find good ways to measure it in a way that I think is meaningful. Anecdotally, when I've hired someone to interview my students after they've participated in here, they'll say, oh yeah, it feels more motivating, but it's hard to like really report something reliable related to it. So from a like human nature perspective, yeah, that would be, there's lots of good theories to support that. I just don't know how to collect the data appropriately on that to answer your question. Yeah.
And then my other question was, like, you mentioned that you're doing this in mostly like upper year courses. Have you had a chance to look or implement these in like a first year course? Because I imagine even the students that are participating in it, they may respond like kind of differently and see different values depending on the stage of their academic career.
Yeah, 100%. So the students' levels and expectations. I do another body of research in something called productive failure, which is my true love. And that I am allowed to, I do my experiments with first year students because it works better for that type of research. But you do have to do a lot of like norm setting with students to say this is meant to be hard, you're not supposed to know the answers, and that tends to work. But that only works once the students know who I am. So if that makes sense, like there's a little bit of trust there that has to happen, that I'm I'm not looking at this to see what percentage you get. I'm using this as a learning tool, and that's hard to do. So yeah, and as far as whether I've used it regularly in first years, they only let me teach in third year, so I actually have never taught a first year class there yet. So, but I would probably, there's nothing that would stop me from using it in that setting. Yeah. Yes. Hi. Yeah.
Just wondering, in terms of thinking about it in terms of recall, I was thinking, could it be possible that it simply primes them to pay attention to that particular thing?
Yeah.
And then the recall happens because they were already introduced to it in a way of kind of like piquing their curiosity. But then when they do encounter it again, then it's the reinforcement.
Yeah.
That particular seed, like it's as if you're planting a seed, which they then come back to just because they're primed to pay attention.
Yeah, I love the metaphor of planting a seed. I haven't used that before, but I think that's right. And I think even just exposing that gap, like there's lots of things we all don't know, and exposing that in a way that they can then just see that. So when the puzzle, it's not that simple, but when they see the puzzle piece that fits, it's more meaningful to them. Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, thanks. Do I have time? Yeah, yep.
Question I often struggle with the follow-up. Basically, like you could summarize it as, do you think chocolate is good but spinach is better to the students?
Yeah.
The question is, do you talk about your students in class about why spinach is better? How do they react? Because often the problem is trust me, it's better, but they don't trust me.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, they won't listen. It doesn't matter. And I probably wouldn't have listened either. Like, it's not them or me. But I do think there are studies that show that if you explain it to students, that it doesn't always make a really big difference, to be honest. So this is why I've used like participation marks as incentives. I think in the upper years, you do get a little bit more traction with that. But the truth is, even for me, when I know that testing before or testing after is better than rereading and rereading, like I still do it because it still feels good. So no, like I think that's the thing with desirable difficulty. So even though I know it, it's just finding the right incentive structure for that to happen. So, but different students respond in different ways. So if I have students who have backgrounds in psychology before they come to pharmacy, this makes so much more sense to them. Like anecdotally, if I'm meeting with them in office hours. But where I do find it helps, and especially like in my role, I'm very interested in struggling students. Like my students who do well are amazing. They're going to do well no matter how great or bad I do. But the ones who are struggling, if they come to see me because things aren't going well, then I can get some traction because I'll just say, look, what you're doing right now is not working. So like in that, I guess, population, then I find I get much more traction and actually see pretty good results. Yeah, so. Okay. Thanks for your questions. Yeah.